There we are. Well, it's almost 12 noon. So welcome all of you who decided to join us. It's a pleasure to have you. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Jonathan Clark, and I run a consultancy business near Oxford, advising people that live in historic houses and traditional houses about energy efficiency. Now I've just got to press one button so we can move on to the presentation. Here we are. Let's have a look here. Share. Here we go. This is good.
It's 12 hours.
There. Now I'm hopeful you can all see the first chart here. Energy efficiency for historic buildings. As I say, I've been running this business for about 15 years now, and we've advised many people in many different historic houses, and it's been very interesting, and we keep learning a lot as we go along. Most of the houses that I tend to advise on, and they are houses, tend to be closer to where I live, inevitably. And that's fairly Oxford based, so somewhere fairly central, but we do travel farther afield for larger houses and bigger projects. And I have even advised the New York Historic House Trust in the United States on some of their historic buildings in New York State, but we don't normally go that far. So we've covered quite a lot of ground. This is a quick flick through a few of the grander houses that I've advised on. They cover all sorts of different periods, and some are simply enormous. The largest of which was Holcombe Hall in Norfolk, that we worked on for 2 or 3 months several years ago. But some are also very small, such as this cottage on the right, in Kent, Old Kent Cottage, built in the 1350s, but obviously developed further when bricks became available. A grade 1 listed house, only about half a mile from the entrance to the Channel Tunnel. The one thing we pride ourselves on here at Energy Solutions is we don't take commissions from anybody, and we're not affiliated to any manufacturer at all. What we pride ourselves on offering is considered impartial advice. So looking at what I want to try and cover today in the presentation format, we've already covered a bit about my business, but I just want to look at some of the changes that are coming up very soon within the EU. And I know we've left the EU now, but I suspect our energy policy will shadow very carefully that which is happening in the EU. We'll look at the UK legislation. We'll begin to consider some of the difficult choices for historic buildings. And we're going to look at wall insulation, some factors and considerations about insulating solid walls. Generating and controlling heat will be another part of the presentation, and how you can get the most bang for your pound or your buck is something we'll try and also look at. And I'll also cover, albeit briefly, a look at some of the renewable energy facilities available and low carbon technologies, and how you can get the government grants if you want them. So moving on, the big changes are coming. You may recall that about 18 months ago now, the UN published their report on climate change. The heat is on, and what it was saying was that we need to cut our CO2 emissions by at least 7.5% every year for the next 10 years to meet the terms of the Paris Accord. Last year, emissions have declined quite significantly, which is encouraging, but that was almost entirely COVID driven. and the projections for next year is that they will go up substantially. So the challenge is on, and clearly the EU under Ursula von der Leyen are setting very ambitious targets for themselves, and it's important not to underestimate the growing strength of the green parties within the EU and how that will influence everything that they set aside for legislation. This man in the bottom right, Frans Timmermans, is the man that's charged for driving and developing the new European Green Deal. And I suspect there'll be two great legs to it. One is how they can convert natural gas into hydrogen, and the other that they talk about a lot, but is very politically sensitive, is a carbon border tax. And we'll come on to that a bit later. But that's what our friends are doing within the EU. There is something important that they announced about 6 months ago, actually. It was launched in October 2020, and it's called the Renovation Wave. And it looks at existing buildings and how they can at least double the annual energy renovation rate for residential and non-residential buildings by 2030, and to foster deep energy renovations. And they will be looking to set minimum energy efficiency standards for all buildings by 2030, and all buildings must have or will have to have a proportion of their energy sourced from renewables. But what about historic buildings, you would cry? Well, that's a very good question, and that hasn't yet been decided. And there are heated arguments going already between the green factions and the conservation factions, trying to hammer out how they can get the best balance for that. This will cost a vast amount of money, and it's to be partly funded by the EU Recovery and Resilience Facility, which was set up as part of the programme to recover from COVID. Some 672 billion euros set aside, and a portion of that will undoubtedly go to the EU renovation wave. Coming back home, looking at UK legislation, we have undoubtedly set ourselves extremely ambitious targets here in the UK, indeed to be a net zero CO2 emitter by 2050. And recently, the UK Parliament has enshrined in law a number of things. The first is nationally determined contributions, about which you will shortly be hearing a great deal over the next year or two. It's important to understand that nationally determined contributions can be very specific for developed Western countries, such as ourselves, where we have committed to reduce the UK's emissions by at least 68% by 2030 from 1990 levels. And if that wasn't a big enough challenge, the sixth carbon budget was approved in Parliament on April the 21st to cut emissions by 78% by 2035 compared to 1990 levels. So those are amazingly ambitious targets. Just returning briefly to the nationally determined contributions, in less developed countries such as poorer countries in Africa and indeed India and China, nationally determined contributions tend not to be so specific. And the UN parties involved have accepted that they can be more broad and have more flex. So they won't be as specific, but the general consensus is that all the traditional Western economies will publish very detailed and highly committed nationally determined contributions. You might wonder how on earth we're going to achieve these very ambitious targets. And the government published last November their 10-point plan for a green industrial revolution. And it talks about a lot of things such as offshore wind, low carbon hydrogen, nuclear power, and have no doubt if we're to become a carbon neutral economy, we will have to rely to a degree on nuclear power. We'll have a lot of electric cars, there'll be a lot more cycling and walking, and we'll be putting biofuel in our jet airliners as we whiz off on holiday, and in our shipping as we ship stuff around the world. One of the points relates to greener buildings, and the last few cover carbon capture and storage, our natural environment, and finally the money men will be working out how we can fund all of this, as they will have to do so. Considering greener buildings and the future home standards, the government said they will launch in 2025 via Part L and F of the building regulations significantly higher standards for new build properties, making them much more thermally efficient with low carbon heating. Well, there's no surprise there really, but they also target to introduce 600,000 heat pump installations per year by 2028. And they will look to upgrade substantially the energy efficiency requirements for privately let properties. What they haven't do, and what will become the great big issue, is they haven't yet enforced owners of existing buildings, privately owned buildings, to improve their energy efficiency. And this will be the great political nettle that somebody is going to have to grasp sooner or later. The government did flirt with it some time ago with what was known as consequential improvements, whereby with large, very large commercial and public buildings, if you wanted to make significant changes to them, for which you required planning permission, such as putting a new glass and steel facade on an office building, then you had to upgrade the heating facilities accordingly. And they did dip their toe in the water briefly in 2012 when they talked about something that became known as the conservatory tax, where if you wanted to put a conservatory on the back of your house for which you required planning permission, the thought was you could only do so if you at the time upgraded your boiler and upgraded your windows as well. The government very quickly realized that was a political hot potato, or indeed political suicide, and rapidly withdrew from that. But that is an arena that they're going to have to enter again sooner or later. Which brings us to COP26 in November in Glasgow, which has been delayed obviously from last year. And it will be a key moment in all of this. John Kerry, the new special envoy for climate change in the US, reckons it's our last best chance to try and do something significant for the world. Alok Sharma, who will be chairing it or as president, says there are 5 key areas that he's looking at: restoring nature, adaptation and resilience, clean energy, clean transport, and finance. He has also recently said that COP26 must consign coal to history. And it's well recognized that if China, India, and the United States stop burning coal tomorrow, we would in one single step be halfway to meeting our 2050 climate requirements. But that's not likely to happen soon. So that brings us to some difficult choices that we're going to have to consider for historic buildings. And these are just some shots of various historic buildings, which are really there just to prompt us to begin to think about it. On the top left, we've got very traditional farmhouses and barns, timber framed in Austria actually, where they're very willing to slap on lots of solar PV panels. Similarly, at the Great Royal Palace in Stockholm, they can hide them away on the flat roof quite well. And rather more controversially, the 2 slides on the bottom and the right, Lisbon City Hall was subject to a huge and very expensive energy refurbishment as a pioneering project a few years ago. And they decided that using some of the 850,000 euros that they spent on it, they would remove all the Victorian glass from the building and replace it with low energy heat reflecting glass. Now, to get the Victorian glass out, they had to damage a lot of it, so they lost some of the historic fabric, but it was considered something that they should do. Similarly, the cloisters at Erfurt Cathedral in the bottom right have been interlined on the inside of the walls with climate change boards, which is not reversible. You can't easily get those off the walls without causing some considerable damage. And the other thought you need to consider is how ambitious we should be, or how high should we aim. And I'm sure you will all have heard of passive houses, which require remarkably little energy to heat and cool them all year. The Passive House Institute runs something called Enefit, which brings passive house standards to refurbishment of existing buildings. And all the great architectural practices have taken traditional or historic buildings and tried to get them as energy efficient as they can, and if possible, to meet their Enefit standards, which are about 1/7 to 1/10 of what it would normally require to heat an existing building. And this is the Bloomsbury townhouse, done by Pruitt Bisley Architects a few years ago. And it is spectacular, and it does show it can be done, but it is very expensive, and you would have to budget at least £1,000 a square metre for that. Which brings us to the UK legislation. Now, where are we? Oh, sorry, I pressed the wrong button there. My mistake. There we are. Right, now UK energy efficiency is imposed mainly through building regulations, and it looks at the various different parts and the approved documents. The big exception to this is relatively new legislation that was introduced in 2015 called the Minimum Energy Efficiency Standards for Let Dwellings, and it applies to privately let dwellings all over the country. The approved documents provide guidance and state that reasonable provision shall be made for the conservation of fuel and power in buildings. Happily, building regulations provide some protection for historic buildings. And if we look at the bottom there, it clearly states such buildings are exempt to the extent that compliance would unacceptably alter their character or appearance. And that wording was lifted directly from the EU directive at the time. There's also special consideration for traditional buildings. If you look farther down that chart, you can see it also includes buildings of traditional construction with permeable fabric that both absorbs and readily allows the evaporation of moisture. And the aim should be to improve energy efficiency without prejudicing character or increasing the risk of long-term deterioration. Where it gets really difficult is when we get on to the thorny issue of energy performance certificates. And you may recall these were introduced a long time ago, back in August 2007, with the best intentions possible. But these are particularly difficult because they are the trigger point as to determining whether a building should or should not be bound by the minimum energy efficiency standards for let dwellings. And trying to understand whether you need an energy performance certificate for a listed house is actually very difficult. It is quite unclear in the legislation, although some of it clearly states that listed buildings will not necessarily be exempt from the requirements to have a valid EPC, and it's up to individual owners to determine whether they should or not. It also says that if you're in doubt, you should seek advice from your local authority's conservation officer. Helen Bartos, in the bottom left there, is the girl that writes the legislation for this. And in fairness to her, she was using exactly the wording in the EU directives, which was embodied within the UK legislation. And as I walk around Oxford sometimes, and now that we can go and shop more normally, and I look in the estate agents' windows at the very expensive houses they're selling in Oxford, many of them on their particulars have a big star that says, this is a listed building and does not require an energy performance certificate. That's not strictly true. And Helen Bartos has recognized that there is confusion about this, and they will seek to clarify the position. But that, in fairness, was a couple of years ago, and they've been rather busy with Brexit and COVID ever since. But they recognize it's a difficult area and they need to address it. Just considering briefly the minimum energy efficiency standards for let dwellings, the reason why it's such a thorny issue is that looking to 2030, the government plan to move about 3.33 million let dwellings from the low energy categories F, G, and E, and even the middling performance category D, all up to energy performance category C. That will cost hundreds of millions of pounds and is a massive challenge. And I'm not convinced that anybody has a clear roadmap as to how we're going to do that. In the UK, it's become very clear, compared to some of our continental neighbours, that we're very slow to invest in energy efficiency initiatives. This was something that the government were well aware of, and in December 2016, they asked Dr. Peter Bonfield to issue a report and an analysis of it, and he published his report, Each Home Counts, which basically said homeowners in the UK are very unwilling to invest in energy efficiency because they don't trust many of the contractors who come in to do the work, or the people trying to sell them energy efficiency materials such as solar panels or insulation, and they don't believe half of what they're being told. So there's a lot of resistance there. This report was slated very heavily by the IHBC because it didn't consider traditional solid wall buildings at all. But the government took it seriously and launched their Trustmark campaign, which tries to bring some sort of credibility to companies selling energy efficiency equipment and contractors who fit it. Allied to that is the publicly available specification, or PAS as it's commonly known, 2030, which also tries to lock in these Trustmark standards to Green Deal approved installers. Now, I know the Green Deal's long gone here in the UK, but the Trustmark standards haven't. And they too are also echoed in the later PAS 2035, which I don't think is yet a British standard, but it may well become one. And this is a very good document if you want to buy it, about covering how measures are installed, commissioned and handled, and looking at the standards required. And it's been drafted by some very good people, such as the AECB, the STBA and the BRE and so on. So it's a good document and it's worth looking out for. Which brings us on to energy efficiency in old houses. I use 4 basic principles when I'm looking at historic buildings. And the first and most important thing I do is try and understand the house. And I try and think very carefully how we can get that house or building to hang on to heat better. And that's always the starting point. And then we look at how we can efficiently produce heat and control it. And finally, we have to consider very carefully how to do no harm. So, considering hanging on to the heat, and we're only touching on wall insulation today. There are lots of other things we could have looked at, but time is pressing with these lunchtime lectures. So we're just considering insulation and wall insulation in particular. A long time ago, in the first report to Parliament, the Independent Committee on Climate Change accurately calculated that the greatest potential of all for saving energy in UK homes was solid wall insulation. It was almost twice as big as the next biggest factor on that list. So it's important. But you have to understand that insulating solid walls in historic buildings is actually very difficult. And this is Colin King, the director of the BRE in Wales, who said he'd inspected hundreds of solid wall insulation systems over recent years, and 95% of them have failed. And the reason they failed, well, there are many and complicated, but one of the big ones is people doing the work are not nearly as careful as they should be, and it needs to be of a much higher standard if it's to be done well. And there are lots of insulation options when you're considering solid wall insulation. There are clearly breathable and unbreathable systems, and just about anybody and everybody is pushing them very hard at the moment, and that will no doubt continue. But it is getting more complicated. You may well be aware of all the work that Historic England have done on their Victorian terraced house in New Bolsover, where they've insulated all of the walls with both breathable and unbreathable materials. And somewhat to their surprise, they have found that the unbreathable synthetic materials seem to be performing very well with no apparent damage to the building fabric. So it is complicated, but you need to consider some other things to be sure. When I'm looking at historic buildings, in fairness, and I should have said this to begin with, we just look at the walls and we say, look, the walls are what they are. We're going to leave those. We know we're losing a lot of heat, but that's a bridge too far at this moment for a historic building. But I suspect as we go through the next 5 or 10 years, we're going to have to look very carefully at that decision, and a time may well come when we're going to have to consider at least breathable wall insulation systems more carefully. There's now lots of advice you can get on these, and a very good publication I would recommend is A Bristolian's Guide to Solid Wall Insulation, and it's a free download from Bristol City Council, and it's an excellent publication. And there are lots of others, so you're not short of information if you want to look for it. Aerogel insulation has lots of advantages. It is very expensive, but it is very thin, but extremely thermally efficient, and it is breathable. Historic Scotland use it a lot, and they think it's fantastic for insulating the cheeks of dormer windows, where you can retain the very narrow profiles without having to fatten it out with great wadges of insulation. And Historic Scotland have published some very good technical papers on it. Technical paper number 15 is good and is a free download from their website. In Scotland, there's a company called the Proctor Group, who are the leading manufacturer in the UK. They're based at Blairgowrie, and they've done some fabulous work insulating listed buildings, both here and indeed in Paris, looking or using their aerogel systems. And they do a terrific online, free to view YouTube presentation, which lasts an hour and a half, on everything you would want to know about insulating solid walls. And it focuses on aerogel in particular. And it looks very carefully at how you need to balance heat versus air versus moisture and get that balance right. But it's a great watch, and if you want to look at it seriously, then I would commend that to you. There are much thicker but very breathable insulation materials such as wood fiber boards, mainly made by large German companies like Steico and others, can't remember, Gutes, who are very big, very good, and they use them a lot in Germany, and they are very good. But clearly you can't fit that sort of volume of insulation to the inside of a wall without changing the nature of the room, and you will have problems around window and door reveals. There's a very good review of wood fiber board on that YouTube clip done by a very bright woman in America called Belinda Carr, who does a lot of specialist YouTube lectures on insulation. But it is really good. She reckons Europe are about 25 years ahead of the USA when it comes to advanced wood fiber board insulation. But there will be some places where this is very usable and it can work very well. And as I say, it's great because it's very breathable. It has to be fitted very carefully. You mustn't get any air gaps behind it. So you need considerable care to do it well. Another form of breathable insulation is what we call here climate boards, but they're German and were launched in Germany about 15 years ago, Calistherm Klimaplate. They're very good. They're made of lime, silica, and sand, and they are very breathable. They're very expensive to make, but they're using them extensively in historic buildings in Germany. Historic Scotland have used them on several properties that they've been working on, and they can be very good where you have damp in walls, because they do allow the walls to breathe. Dresden University have done a lot of work on this building in Nuremberg, a 16th century German hunting lodge. And there are very few historic buildings left in Nuremberg, so they're very careful with them. But this one, they did apply Calistherm Klimaplate boards to, and have been very pleased with how moisture has been controlled and the thermal improvements that have been achieved. It's been used widely in some public buildings in places like Amsterdam. This is the National Gallery, work done by Arup more than 10 years ago now, but they too have been very pleased. And as I mentioned earlier, this is Erfurt Cathedral in what used to be East Germany, where they lined all the cloisters out with climate board. It's terrific. It seems to regulate humidity really well. It comes in different thicknesses, and it's very porous. But you have to realize it is very expensive to do this work, you know, at least £100 a square meter. It cannot be glued to gypsum plaster. And I've been in buildings in Germany where they have stripped all the plaster off the internal walls and then put a base coat of lime plaster on the walls, so they can then fit the climate board and then put another coat of lime plaster on top. And clearly making such changes are not easily reversible. Historic Scotland, as I mentioned, have done quite a lot of work on this, and they used WUFI analysis to try and identify where the condensation risks occur most for internal wall insulations, but they did find climate boards to present the least risk for condensation. So well worthy of consideration. If you live in a house that has an external render, then you might consider, as we did on our house, taking off the cement render that was applied in the 1960s and replacing it with an insulated lime render. and 2 coats. Your base coat will contain all sorts of lightweight inclusions, whatever you want really, whether it's cork or graded glass granules, clay beads, hemp, all sorts of things. And then your thick top coat goes on top. It can work extremely well, but you need to have the work done by people that really know what they're doing. You have to go into it with your eyes open a bit. Dr. Caroline Rye has been doing a lot of research work on this for SPAB and the STBA people, and she's found results can be variable, and where problems have tended to occur is where buildings are in particularly exposed areas where they're subject to lots of driving rain, and you tend not to make such a good transformation as you might hope for with that. But most of the time it can work very well. There are other newer systems coming on board now. Diathanite is a breathable cork lime render supplied by the Ecological Building Systems Company up in Carlisle. They're an Irish company, but they cover the country nationally, and they're very good breathable systems. And if you want more information, then I would advise you to consult their website. They also do internal plasters, which contain cork, which have some insulative properties, and they're good and well worth considering. But clearly, if you're going to paint them, you need to paint them with breathable paints that allow air and moisture to breathe through them. Right, at a quick canter now, I'm just going to touch on generating and controlling heat. Clearly, most of us have got rid of all our very old boilers in our houses and replaced them with new condensing boilers. And indeed, that has been one of the successes of the government's energy policy over the last 10 or 12 years. They have more than achieved the installation of 12 million condensing boilers in houses. And so they have done well, and that's undoubtedly saved very considerable volumes of energy. Although you'll be aware that no new gas boilers are to be fitted to new build properties in the UK from January the 1st, 2025. And I see this week the International Energy Association in Paris want to make it a legal requirement for all of the EU that no new gas boilers should go in any building or house from January the 1st, 2025. So we'll have to see whether our government will be willing to be as brave as that, but their days are probably coming to an end. There are lots of considerations, and I won't go through all the details about how you manage flumes and pipe runs and so forth. One thing worth remembering, if you have got a really efficient modern condensing boiler, you must have it serviced regularly. Otherwise, it very quickly loses its efficiency. And one further thought on such boilers is, if you're clever, you can run boiler flues wherever you want. And there are specialist companies that can help you with that, so you don't have to put unsightly flues exiting historic buildings. So the question is, if we're not using gas, what are we going to use? And there's lots of talk at the moment, and no doubt it will continue, about hydrogen, the most common element in all of the universe. And you think, well, this is good. We've got lots of it. It can't be too tricky. We won't get there in one go, though, but there is an interim step, and these are now becoming available in the UK, and they're called hydrogen fuel cell boilers, and they're hugely popular in Japan, where they've installed well over 200,000 systems, and they run on natural gas. But importantly, they don't burn the natural gas, creating fossil fuels. They trigger a chemical reaction with a natural gas that then produces hydrogen, which is then used to produce heat and electricity, and quite decent outputs of both heat and electricity. And you can watch YouTube articles about them. They're not cheap though. Such a fuel cell boiler could easily be 12 to 14,000 pounds, you know, easily 3 to 4 times the price of replacing a traditional gas boiler. And all the big boiler companies are aware that the government's long-term ambition is to replace natural gas with hydrogen in one form or another. And therefore, they're trying to develop hydrogen-ready boilers. The good news is that an existing natural gas boiler can burn hydrogen that's bled into the system up to a quantity of about 10% with no need to change the boiler at all. If you go above that, then it's a relatively small change to a gas boiler, just looking to change the burner, the gas valve, and a small circuit board that would cost about £200. So you could then burn pure hydrogen. Hydrogen is made in lots of different ways, and at the moment, most of it is made using vast amounts of energy. But the holy grail, of course, is to produce hydrogen, which is known as green hydrogen, from renewable energy sources. You may have noticed recently that BP proposed the largest hydrogen project in the UK in Teesside, where they hope by 2030 to be producing 20% of all of the hydrogen that the UK will need. Initially, though, they'll produce it using natural gas, but looking at the location of that, you have to believe, and seeing the wind turbines on the left, that renewable energy will be a key factor in powering that hydrogen plant in the future. So an exciting area to watch, but lots of huge technical barriers to overcome. Heating controls are really important. You must have the basic suite of heating controls. Unfortunately now, many of them are becoming digitalized, which is really good. And importantly, a lot of them are available now in a wireless format, which is fantastic for old buildings. So a very good investment. They don't cost a lot of money. We'll come on to that later, but if you can upgrade your heating controls, it's well worth the money. Just a brief note on heat emitters. We have done some successful work with infrared heat panels made by companies like Herschel, who are a German company, but they have offices in the UK. And they seem to work very well. They don't always work well. And I say to clients, you know, if you're interested in such electrical heating, buy 1 or 2 panels, and they are fairly expensive, and see how you get on. Try them. And if they work for you, and it can be very building dependent, then consider extending it to other places. Underfloor heating is great if you've got it. Dorchester Abbey fitted about 19 years ago a very good underfloor heating system that was terrific. Used to be described as the coldest church in all of Oxfordshire, and now it's generally considered one of the most comfortable. You do need to manage damp incredibly carefully in such buildings if you're installing underfloor heating. The top right shot there shows a guy pouring a liquid concrete mix over a membrane, a solid membrane, which is fine if you live in a new build house with good damp-proof courses in the walls. But if you're trying to do such a system in an old building, you must not fit a damp-proof membrane. You must use a breathable limecrete system or slate filling system, which are much more expensive, so the floors can breathe naturally and you don't drive lots of moisture into the walls. Be very careful with electric underfloor heating options. I had a client who insisted on installing electric underfloor heating in a barn that they converted into an art gallery, and they were utterly horrified at the cost of running it. It can work quite well for very small rooms like bathrooms. So quantifying the benefits, or how much bang you get for your buck, can be helpful. And this is something I use quite a lot. It's a formula used by Danish Building Control for many years, and it's this formula here. we look at how much money a particular initiative, energy efficiency initiative, would save. So if you were looking to change your boiler, you might say it might save £300 or £400 a year, and you multiply that by the year's life, how long that initiative is going to last. So a boiler might last 15 years, and you divide it by the capital cost, which may be, I don't know, for a new boiler, £3,000 or £4,000, and it gives you a resulting number. And the key is, the higher that number is, the better. Anything less than 1.33 needs further justification. This was unusually a house very close to where I live, which wasn't listed, but it was interesting to run these calculations over. Solid stone walls, original windows. It had a fairly new, reasonably efficient LPG boiler, and it was costing £3,000 a year to heat. And this is about 7 or 8 years ago now. And then when we look at the calculations we ran on it, the column of numbers on the right is what you want to look at. And what we're looking for are particularly high numbers, which are the real winners. So improving the loft insulation with sheep wool, the one at the top, with a result of 15, was really good. And that was principally driven by the fact that although sheep wool insulation is very expensive, it does last forever. Really good. So it gave it a very high score. And other things were not quite so good, but still worth considering, like draft proofing, the worst windows and doors. Excuse me. Thermal paints, well, we got very excited about those about 5 years ago, but we're less excited by them now. The big win, though, always is fitting damper plates in open chimneys or chimney balloons in unused chimneys. And I'm always staggered how many historic houses I go into people's drawing rooms, and they say, we can't understand why this room is so cold. And I look up the chimney from the fireplace, and you can see the clear blue sky above the chimney, and there is the reason. It's relatively easy to get a good blacksmith to make a damper plate, so you can open the damper plate when you light the fire, but close it when the fire's gone out. Replacing the boiler in this building didn't seem to work too well as a cost, because it was a relatively efficient boiler anyway. Fitting intelligent heating controls was a win, a real win, and well worth doing. They had an ARGA, and we looked at the ARGA's intelligent management system. It was okay, but fairly expensive. It was just about worth replacing the old hot water cylinder, but it definitely was not worth replacing the windows. So don't be tempted to fit new double glazed windows. There are many other things you can do to windows which are much more cost effective. So a quick canter through renewables. The good news is renewable energy is getting much cheaper. And this was in The Economist this week, actually, showing how things like solar, offshore wind and onshore wind have declined in price dramatically over the last 10 years. And so too, I see battery storage systems. They're plummeting in cost. This is a biggish section on renewables and burning firewood. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but I will just touch on a few of the charts. You need to get the most from your firewood if you can. And a friend of mine lets lots of properties in Oxfordshire to London clients through the winter. He reckons he can charge a 40% higher rent for houses that have either an open wood fire or a wood burning stove. So people like burning wood. Count Rumford, you'll all know, I'm sure, who designed his famous fireplaces. They were very good at throwing a lot more heat into a traditional room from an open fire. And indeed, these are his fireplaces that he did for Thomas Jefferson in Monticello. You can upgrade the performance of open fires better by inserting a cassette or an insert fire, which is basically a metal box that superheats the air behind the firebox and vents that back into the room. And they can be very efficient. And you could even go the full hog and install what is effectively a glass-fronted wood-burning stove in an open fireplace. And yes, I know it detracts from the beauty of an open fireplace, but they are dramatically more efficient, and insurance companies tend to love them because it substantially reduces the fire risk. There are lots of good wood-burning stove companies. I'm a great fan of these in Sweden, Norway, and Denmark. If you have time, look at their websites. And these are some of their best-selling models. You may well have seen some of the publicity about the government being determined to crack down on pollution in London with wood-burning stoves. And they have published their clean air strategy a couple of years ago, and all new wood-burning stoves must comply or be eco-design ready with these standards. And if you look at the picture of the wood-burning stove, that's ours at home actually, you can see a tiny row of dots just above the logs, and that's where oxygen is bled into the firebox, and it has a secondary burn process where it burns the combustion gases as well, giving you a very clean burn. And only those sort of wood-burning stoves will be allowed from next year. They're very, very clean. Pellet stoves are good. They're widely used in Scandinavia, and wood pellets are great because they have a very low moisture content, but such wood-burning stoves won't run automatically if there's a power cut. And this actually is from the Woodstock wood-burning stove company, the best-selling wood-burning stove in the United States. And all wood-burning stoves in the United States now have to have catalytic converters that are changed every year. Many wood-burning stoves now come clad not in cast iron, but in soapstone, which absorbs and releases heat very slowly, because a lot of these very efficient wood-burning stoves burn very quickly and can't burn for more than about 2.5 hours with a full load of fuel. So the day of piling up the old firebox and hoping it will be smouldering in the morning have long gone. Lots of things to consider about your flue, but you have to get it right. Hot tips, well, they're all good, obvious things. I won't go through them all now, but only burn well-seasoned wood. And if you're into wood burning in the middle of winter, then you must get this book, Norwegian Wood, Chopping, Stacking and Drying Wood by Lars Meiting. It's a huge international seller and it's fantastic. Right, quick trip on biomass. Biomass boilers are good. They burn wood pellets or wood chips. Wood pellets normally on a smaller scale, but they are expensive. And I've had clients who've said, well, it's just like buying a new BMW and parking it in the cellar. And it can be in a way by the time you've installed the whole systems, but they can be very effective. And this is Middleton Park in Oxfordshire, where we did a lot of work about 5 years ago. They did have an old oil-fired central heating system that was costing them £200 a day to heat the privately sold apartments. And we switched the whole thing over to a new wood pellet heating system in the cellar, which is now costing them £9 a day net of the renewable heat incentive. Heat pumps. Now, we've mentioned heat pumps several times before, and you're going to hear a lot more about them, I'm sure, over the coming years. They can work efficiently for some older houses, but I think you need to proceed with caution. If you're building a new passive house, they work fantastically well. But if you live in a historic building that doesn't hang on to heat well and doesn't have a wet underfloor heating system, you need to be very cautious. There is a halfway house that you can consider, but it's expensive, where companies like Daikin will sell you a hybrid heat pump system, where the heat pump will do all the base load work, but when the weather gets very cold, the fossil fuel boiler, either oil or gas, will kick in to do the heavy lifting. And that's well worth considering. My one piece of important advice, though, about heat pumps is, if you are thinking about buying a heat pump for your home, then for goodness sake, buy this book. It's by a chap called John Cantor, who probably knows more about heat pumps than anybody in the country. It's very readable, and he will caution you to treat very carefully some of the sales patter that these people are pushing around from heat pump companies at the moment. So a great book and well worth having. Just to be aware, there are things on the horizon that could be very exciting regarding heat pump technology. And the British government have just injected £10 million into this technology, near isothermal Stirling heat pumps, which uses Stirling engine technology inside heat pumps to make them dramatically more efficient. You can't buy these yet. They're still probably 3 or 5 years away, but when they do come, that could be transformational. PV panels, well, they can be good. They can be very good. An average UK house uses about 3,000 to 4,000 kilowatt hours of electricity a year, and this row of panels in the garden of a listed house would produce something like that. They're relatively old panels, those that are only 250 watts. You can buy panels now of 300, 350 watts, or possibly even 400. So you wouldn't necessarily need so many panels as that. Happily though, the cost of such panels has fallen very considerably, and what Solar Southwest are saying there is that 10 years ago, such an array of panels would have cost £15,000. Today, it would only cost £5,000. If you can afford it, solar slates can be much preferable, but you need to consider they're typically about 3 times the price of solar panels, and they won't generate as much electricity, but they're well worth considering and may have a role to play. The trouble, of course, with these technologies is the sun don't shine all the time, and therefore, if you want to take it seriously, if you're going to want to charge up an electric car at night or something, you're going to have to invest in battery storage. Happily, the price of big batteries is falling, but they're not cheap, but they can make your solar power systems much more flexible. The government always consult Dieter Helm in Oxford, Oxford University, about their energy policy every now and again, and he published a great book 2 or 3 years ago called Burnout, and he really says that, you know, it is all about PV and batteries, and they are the future. So government grants, grab them if you can. Feed-in tariffs used to pay you hugely generously for anything that generated electricity, whether it was PV panels or hydro systems, wind turbines, or if you were lucky enough to have a large dairy herd of cows, anaerobic digestion. And there was even some work done in the early days on combined heat and power systems, which have worked very well in very large commercial buildings, but tend not to work well in small homes. There are no more feed-in tariffs. They've been stopped completely. They did drive a lot of PV panel sales and have worked very well. But the government realized with falling prices, they no longer needed to subsidize them. The renewable heat incentive we mentioned before, it has been extended to the end of March next year, so it's only got another year to run. And it applies to things like ground source heat pumps and air to water heat pumps, solar thermal and biomass. And the tariffs are generous. So if you want to install one of those, get in quick before these very generous grant levels come to an end. The government introduced with some considerable fanfare last August green home grants. And we thought, oh, this is great. And they were making available potentially very significant sums of money for people to improve the energy efficiency of their homes. And we thought, great. But by January the 21st, for all sorts of reasons, only £75 million have been spent due to the slowness of giving out grants. There seem to be lots of administrative problems, and it never worked nearly as well as the government hoped. And they then said that we'd only make £320 million available up until last March, and now that's passed, it's effectively gone. But I heard Kwasi Kwarteng, the Business Energy Secretary, saying that there will be further grants which will be confirmed for this after the spending review in 2021. So in the autumn, we might know more. The renewable heat incentive grants will be replaced by what's known as clean home grants, and they come in from April 2022. We don't have all the details on this, but all the initial guidance looks or appears they will be substantially less generous than the renewable heat incentive. And they're really targeted at installing heat pumps with a small amount set aside for biomass fuel systems. So we'll have to see, but my advice is if you're after any of those new renewable heat systems, get them within the next 10 months. Things you need to look out for, well, we're all going to become very familiar with our nationally determined contributions that the government are going to or have already set. What they really need to do is publish a detailed roadmap that lays out just how we're going to get there and how we're going to fund it. And that is something we're seriously lacking at the moment. It's worth keeping an eye on the UK carbon emissions trading schemes. We shadow precisely as members of the EU emission trading scheme, where the big polluters, especially people like energy generators, had to pay very high tax on carbon emissions. The UK somewhat altruistically added another premium on top of that of £18 a tonne in carbon, which very quickly drove out of business all our coal electricity producers. But they will continue to make sure that has bite. It would be very interesting to see whether the government are going to introduce a carbon tax in one form or another, or indeed a carbon border tax, although John Kerry, the American Secretary of State, has made it very clear that that would unleash the biggest world trade war the world had yet seen. So we shall see. We've got to look for the natural gas to hydrogen transfer, and it'd be very interesting to see what we're all going to be driving in 9 years' time. Just a final note, if you spend a lot of money on a new electric car, you need to understand that they're not carbon neutral by any means. Indeed, it requires a lot more carbon energy to produce an electric car than a traditional internal combustion engine car. A great book to look out for is Mariana Sir and Roger Hunt's Old House Eco Handbook. It's got lots of really good information in it. It was recently republished as the second edition, and it's well worth having. And my second last chart is a quote from John Kerry, which I stumbled across. He was apparently on the Andrew Marr show on Sunday, which I didn't see. But he said, "I'm told by scientists that 50% of the reductions we have to make to get to net zero are going to come from technologies that we don't yet have. That's just a reality." Well, I sincerely hope he's right, because I think we're going to need all that scientific development to hit the very ambitious targets that we're committing to. And finally, my last chart is remember to tread extremely carefully, because it's no light sin to destroy anything which is old.